All right, so we've been talking here about Mitch McConnell's failure theater, as Rachel coined it, which is basically he seems to have decided to get everything he wants by putting the $2,000 checks and this election fraud nonsense commission and Section 230 repeal all together in one bill rather than having a straight up or down vote on just $2,000 checks. Rachel happens to be, an expert on Section 230, what it is, what it means, how everybody involved thinks about it. Just talk about this move and what repeal of Section 230 would actually do.
So this is a tiny provision of law that has gotten outsized attention, definitely in the Trump administration, but was starting to get there before. And what it is it's the provision of law that basically is a liability shield for the tech companies. And it also operates across the internet as well. It says that internet companies, platforms, comment sections, and online newspapers cannot be sued for third-party content. So things you and I post, Twitter can't be sued for our tweets. You can be sued for your tweet, but Twitter cannot. And essentially, it's credited with creating the modern internet. It's allowing, tiny companies to grow with a liability shield, with a special carve-out of protection that doesn't apply to other First Amendment actors like newspapers, movie studios. And in that sense, it is a very specific government protection for tech. It is existential to their business model. Mm-hmm. And that is why this debate generates so much light and heat in Washington, is because going after Section 230 is very clearly going after the business model of all of the major tech companies. And, President Trump has really taken a shine to it, if you will, because he feels that the tech companies have been overtly biased against him, right? Not that they're just sort of First Amendment actors making speech decisions, but that these are now companies that rival the government in their power over speech, over independent thought, over, sort of market access in America. And there's a lot of Democrats who agree with that for different reasons. And to be clear, both sides have very different approaches to Section 230. The left and right want to do different things to it. But what is fascinating about this debate is that, there are moneyed interests playing in it very heavily. And I'm speaking specifically about Google, Facebook, Twitter, all of these companies that have funded for a very long time groups of lobbyists and entrenched think tank interests in Washington that have set up an intellectual atmosphere where you are not allowed to question Section 230 at all. And Matt Stoller has talked about this as well. And he had put up a tweet last night that I think really summarizes it correctly. The first point in particular, if you question Section 230 at all, you are just stupid. And that is sort of the atmosphere in Washington right now. And it really goes to show you how corporate interests can change the tenor of the debate in Washington. And that's kind of what you're seeing. That's why it's so violent. And to be clear, all of these groups set it up like Section 230 reform or repeal is an asteroid heading toward the earth, and that free speech on the internet would end, the whole place would burn down, and you would never be able to speak again. None of that is true. There are arguments for keeping Section 230, and there are good ones. But the point is, this should be a debate. And, however this comes out, the Senate has been hiding from this issue for a really long time because, again, there's a lot of money playing in the space. They've been chest thumping about it at hearings, same with Democrats, but they've so far avoided having to actually vote on the matter. And again, as I've said repeatedly, that's the only real accountability we have as voters, is to make our Congress vote. Mitch McConnell is, again, protecting them from having to take a stand on this Section 230 big tech subsidy by combining it with two other issues. We should want clear up or down votes on all of these questions, whether you agree with them or not, because they should all be debates.
So, yeah, and I think that's a really important point to underscore, which is that Section 230 is not going to be repealed this week or next week or anytime in the near future. The reason that Mitch McConnell packaged all these things together was explicitly to make sure that none of them happen, right? That's the whole goal of putting them together, because the checks combined with election fraud means that none of it is ultimately going to get through. However, what Republicans think is that if you repeal Section 230 wholesale, then essentially tech companies are going to be hobbled. And you can tell me if I'm wrong about any of this, Rachel. This is my understanding. Tech companies are going to be hobbled. They're mad at them for a variety of reasons, but the most sort of like flashpoint one is this idea of conservatives are being censored on the internet. And these tech companies are acting like publishers because they're making these editorial decisions about what gets shown and what doesn't, and adding little fact checks to them and all those things that we've seen, especially prominently in the 2020 election. So if you took away their liability shield, then they would no longer be protected from lawsuits for acting like public. They would be treated like publishers, essentially, the way that any, news outlet is, because they're making those editorial decisions. So the thought on the right is that would improve the free speech quality, that tech companies would basically back off. They would stop making censorship or editorial decisions and allow the internet to be just completely wide open with very little editorial decision making on their part. The other direction they could go in, though, it seems to me, is becoming more censorious, kicking off even more content that is even marginally sort of offensive or questionable or politicized at all. Is that a possible outcome of just outright repeal of Section 230 as well?
It is, and I think it's the best argument for reform of Section 230 rather than repeal. But I think what a lot of Republicans are objecting to is this idea that the government is privileging these companies who are acting, recklessly, who are acting in a partisan manner. And why is the government privileging some of the biggest companies in the world to act in ways that Republicans feel are counter to free speech principles? You are completely correct that their business model would 100% change without Section 230 protections. But as a strategic matter, I think a lot of Republicans feel like, hey, why don't we threaten repeal? Because reform is not going to happen unless we credibly threaten repeal. And so I think, a lot of Republicans weren't there, to be honest. But I think after Twitter, after Facebook aggressively censored circulation of the Hunter Biden New York Post story, I think a lot of Republicans just threw up their hands and were like, look, we need to act on this question fast. And that goes to sort of the second sort of comical point about this entire debate, which is that it's entirely self-inflicted. I have never seen companies bring heat down on themselves so dramatically like the big tech companies. And it's not just one-sided. Democrats have a whole host of problems with these platforms as well.
Yeah. The other piece that you highlighted that hadn't come across my radar, not to use the term that we use in the show, but I hadn't noticed, is that Congressman Ken Buck has been tapped to be the next ranking Republican on the House's antitrust panel. That jumped down at you. Why is that significant, Rachel?
Well, Ken Buck is one of the most thoughtful conservative members of the House on big tech issues. He's a member of the House Freedom Caucus. And, unlike a lot of Republicans in the House, he's actually really thoughtfully engaged multiple policy responses to big tech outside of Section 230. He's looked at antitrust, and he's a former prosecutor himself. And he said, look, I care about the free market. If these companies are violating the terms of free market competition, we should consider that. And so, he really put in a lot of the work, I think, with what the House Antitrust Subcommittee did with its big tech investigation over a year and a half. He showed up to every single hearing, really took it seriously, didn't always agree with what the Democrats were trying to do policy-wise, but ended up issuing his own report about what he thought should happen with antitrust, the policy changes that needed to be made to make sure, again, the big tech companies aren't distorting the parameters of free market competition. So in that sense, he's not ideological, he's not reflexive. And for that reason, I think the fact that conservatives, including myself, are lining up behind him for this job shows you how seriously some of us are taking this problem. And that's a new turn, I think, for the right.
Yeah, that is actually really interesting and noteworthy, because some of these hearings that you have, you've got a mix between some people are taking it seriously, some people are just like, here's a tweet that got censored and I'm mad about it. Like, explain why, just sort of grandstanding for the crowd. So very interesting maneuver. Rachel, thank you for breaking all of that down. Next on Rising, editor-in-chief at The Real News and host of Working People podcast, Max Alvarez, and also co-host of the Realignment podcast, Marshall Kosloff. They're going to join us for the panel. That's when Rising returns.